First in. Daniel Mercer wakes up at 4:12 a.m. His knees hurt before he even moves. The house is quiet except for the air recycler humming through the vents. He sits up slowly. His fingers ache like old hinges. 43 years old and he feels 70. Across the room, Elena is sleeping, one arm over her face after another 12-hour ER shift. He slips out of bed and walks downstairs. The kitchen lights come on automatically. The house smells faintly like coffee grounds and plastic. Outside, the backyard lights illuminate the swing set. Liam and Maya forgot their toy rocket in the grass. Daniel stares at it through the window. A bright red plastic rocket pointed at the sky. His tablet buzzes. A notification. He almost ignores it. Probably another debt adjustment. Another polite reminder that his life belongs to mathematics. He opens it, reads the contract, reads it again, then again. The number at the bottom makes him laugh out loud. Not a happy laugh, more like the sound a man makes when something finally makes sense. He leans back in the chair. 43, bad knees, 2 kids, a wife he loves, and a lifetime of payments that will never end. He whispers to the empty kitchen. Well, his voice cracks. He smiles. Guess I'm either dying or getting rich. The tablet screen dimmed, but the words from the contract were burned into his mind. 4 years. Debt erased. He rubbed his hands over his face and stared out the kitchen window. The backyard lights cast soft shadows across the swing set. The toy rocket still lay in the grass. For a long time he simply watched it. 25 years. 25 years of grinding. 25 years of trying to build something that would last. And in a strange way, he had. He thought about the path that had gotten him here. Stocking shelves at midnight while Elena finished nursing school. Pouring concrete in the Arizona heat. Working sales jobs he hated. Taking night classes. Teaching middle school science for 3 miserable years. Finally opening a tiny chiropractic office that barely stayed afloat. Every step it felt like climbing a mountain, like a backpack full of bricks. But when he looked around the house, it had worked. Not perfectly, but it had worked. Their home was small, a little worn. The paint on the kitchen cabinets was chipped and the couch sagged in the middle. But it was warm. There was laughter here. The refrigerator was covered with drawings. Family photos hung crooked along the hallway. And upstairs were the 3 people that made all of it worth it. Elena, Liam, Maya. They were healthy, happy, safe. They had a yard and a park and bikes and birthday parties and friends. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was a good life. Daniel had built that. He allowed himself to feel proud for exactly 10 seconds. Then the numbers returned. Mortgage, loans, interest, the endless slow bleeding of money. He would work until his body gave out, and when he died, the debt would still exist. Everything he built would slowly erode. The system would simply keep taking, forever. He stared at the tablet again. 4 years, one last fight. Either he dies, or he finally wins. Daniel closed the screen. The next morning he woke early, but this time he didn't check work messages. He didn't look at the clinic schedule. He didn't think about patients or bills or insurance approvals. Instead, he made pancakes. Liam stumbled into the kitchen first, hair sticking in every direction. Dad, why are you cooking? Daniel grinned. Because I'm the superior pancake chef. Maya came running down the stairs a moment later. That's not true. Mom is. Traitor, Daniel said dramatically. Elena walked in last, tying her hair back, still sleepy from her shift. She leaned against the counter and smiled at the scene. Daniel caught himself staring at her. Even after all these years, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Not in the glossy, commercial sense. Real beauty, strength, kindness. The kind that carried people through chaos every day in the ER. She noticed him looking. What? She asked. He just shook his head and smiled. Nothing. They spent the entire day together. No errands, no chores, just time. They went to the park. Daniel pushed the kids on the swings until his shoulders burned. They played tag in the grass. Liam tried to convince him to build a rocket engine in the garage. Maya found a beetle and insisted they constructed a proper bug house. Daniel helped her build one from sticks and leaves. In the afternoon, they sat in the backyard and ate cheap grocery store ice cream. The sun sank low and the sky turned orange over the rooftops. Daniel watched his kids running through the yard. Their laughter carried across the neighborhood. For the first time in years, he felt calm. Not trapped, not exhausted, just grateful. That night, the kids fell asleep quickly. Daniel and Elena sat on the couch in the quiet living room. She leaned against him. "You seem different today," she said softly. "Better different or weird different?" he asked. She smiled. "Better." He kissed her forehead. "I just realized something." "What?" He looked around the house. "At some point, we actually made it." She laughed quietly. "Daniel, we're barely breaking even." "Yeah," he said, "but look at them." Upstairs, a faint giggle drifted down the hallway before the kids finally fell asleep. Elena squeezed his hand. "Yeah," she said softly, "we did okay." They sat together a long time. Eventually, they went upstairs. That night, they held each other close, the way couples do when the world feels momentarily quiet and safe. Daniel memorized everything. Her warmth, her laugh, the way she curled against his chest when she fell asleep. He didn't sleep much. He just listened to the sound of his family breathing. Morning came slowly. The sky was still dark when Daniel slipped out of bed. He walked through the hallway and looked into the kids' rooms. Liam sprawled sideways across the bed, Maya clutching a stuffed fox. Daniel closed the doors gently. In the kitchen, he wrote a note. It took him a long time. He rewrote parts several times. When he finished, he folded it carefully and left it on the table, next to the coffee machine where Elena could find it. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked outside. The street was quiet. Early dawn. No cars, no people, just the soft hum of distant traffic. He checked the time. Right on schedule. A minute later, a dark aircraft appeared over the rooftops. Silent, angular, military. It descended slowly and hovered in front of the house. No markings, no lights, just matte black metal. The side door slid open. Inside were a handful of men. Older, tired, men who looked like they had made the same calculation he had. Daniel took one last look at the house. The swing set in the backyard, the kitchen window, the life he had built. He whispered quietly, "I love you." Then he stepped onto the evac transport. The door closed, the aircraft lifted silently into the morning sky, and Daniel Mercer disappeared. The aircraft climbed steadily into the pale desert dawn. Inside the transport, the cabin lights were dim and yellow, casting everyone in the same tired color. Metal branches lined the walls. The vibration of the engines ran up through the floor and into Daniel's boots. There were about 15 men aboard. No one wore uniforms yet, just ordinary clothes, jeans, work boots, hoodies, jackets, men pulled out of ordinary lives. The smell of sweat, old cigarettes, and engine oil hung in the air. For the first few minutes, nobody spoke. Men stared at the floor. Out the small reinforced windows, the suburbs shrank away into grid lines of streetlights and rooftops. Daniel watched his neighborhood disappear into the distance. He forced himself not to think about it. Across from him sat a man with a shaved head and a tattoo crawling up his neck. His eyes were red and hollow. He finally broke the silence. "So what'd they get you for?" Daniel blinked. "Debt," he said simply. The man snorted. "Yeah, same." Another guy leaned forward from down the bench. "Child support," he muttered. Someone else chuckled darkly. "That'll do it." The ice broke quickly after that. Once one man started talking, the others followed. Stories spilled out in rough fragments. A construction worker whose back gave out and the bills buried him. A mechanic who drank away his shop after his divorce. A guy who had bounced through warehouse jobs and lost his apartment. One man admitted quietly he'd been sleeping in his car for 2 months. Another said his sister signed the contract for him because he couldn't read most of it. Figured it was either this or jail anyways, he said with a shrug. Daniel listened more than he spoke. The stories were ugly. Divorces, addictions, debt collectors, dead-end jobs, men who had simply run out of road. One of them finally asked the question, "What about you?" The man with the neck tattoo nodded towards Daniel. "You don't look like the rest of us." Daniel hesitated. He never liked talking about himself. But they were all here now. No point pretending. "I've got a doctorate," he said. The group blinked. "Doctor?" someone asked. "Chiropractic." A few of them whistled. "Damn." Another guy leaned forward. "So how the hell did you end up here?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "Student loans." That got around a bitter laughter. "Yeah," the mechanic said. "That'll do it." Daniel smiled faintly. "I also have a mortgage, 2 kids. Life adds up." One of the younger men studied him carefully. "You married?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah." "Still together?" "Very." That surprised them. "Kids?" "2." "How old?" "9 and 6." A few of the men exchanged looks. One of them shook his head slowly. "Man, you're walking away from that?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands. "Not walking away," he said quietly. "Trying to secure it." They absorbed that. Another man asked casually, "What'd you do before chiropractic?" Daniel hesitated again. "Marine Corps." The men straightened a little. "What kind?" someone asked. "Expeditionary." A low whistle ran through the cabin. "Shit." The neck tattoo guy leaned forward. "You see combat?" Daniel nodded once. "Yeah." "What rank?" "Private." That surprised them again. "Private?" Daniel smiled slightly. "I got out after my enlistment." A guy across the bench studied him more closely now. "So you're a combat vet, a doctor, you got a wife and kids, and you're still here with us idiots?" Daniel shook his head immediately. He looked around the cabin. "You guys aren't idiots." One of them laughed. "You haven't heard my life story yet." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Listen," he said, "I've had a lot of jobs." He started counting them on his fingers. "Construction, warehouse, hospital orderly, sales, teacher." The men looked surprised. "You did all that?" someone asked. "Yeah," Daniel shrugged. 25 years is a long time." The man with the neck tattoo shook his head slowly. "Still, you got a family." Daniel nodded. "Yeah." He paused. "And I'm grateful for that, every single day." The cabin grew quiet. Daniel looked around at them. "I'm not any better than you guys," he said calmly. A few of them shifted uncomfortably. "But you know something?" Daniel continued. "All of you are here." They looked up. "You're still standing." He gestured around the transport. "You made the decision to get up and fight." The mechanic gave a dry laugh. "More like we ran out of options." Daniel smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's the same thing." One of the younger men spoke up. "You really think we got a shot out there?" Daniel looked at him carefully. "Yeah." "How?" Daniel leaned back against the wall. "Because most people quit when life gets hard." He looked around the transport. "You guys didn't." The men were quiet again. Respect had crept into the air. The neck tattoo guy nodded slowly. "Damn." Another man spoke up. "You know what?" "What?" Daniel asked. "If they make you an officer," he pointed around the cabin, "I hope we end up under you." Several of the others nodded. Daniel raised his hands quickly. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." But inside something had shifted. For the first time since boarding the aircraft, Daniel felt something familiar stirring in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Purpose. The transport roared onward into the rising sun, carrying a group of broken men, and one quiet former Marine who, whether he wanted it or not, was already becoming their leader. The transport descended through a sheet of gray morning clouds. Below them, the recruit depot stretched across the desert like a tired industrial scar. Concrete runways, long metal hangars, Rows of low barracks that looked older than Daniel's military service. The aircraft touched down with a heavy thud. Engines whined down. For a moment no one moved. Then the side door slid open. Cold desert wind rushed into the cabin. "All right," a voice called from the outside. "Let's go." The men climbed down one by one. Daniel stepped into the tarmac and looked around. Something immediately felt off. Military bases used to have energy, sharpness, purpose. This place felt drained. The personnel guiding them through the processing moved slowly, like people halfway through a 12-hour shift they'd already repeated 100 times. They weren't rude. They weren't friendly either. Just tired. A corporal with a cybernetic leg waved them toward a line of temporary processing booths. "Scan here." A sergeant missing 2 fingers checked wrist implants. "Next." A woman with a mechanical eye handed out identity bands. "Keep moving." Nobody yelled. Nobody barked orders. It felt less like a military intake and more like a government office. Daniel noticed something else. Almost every soldier here carried damage. Limping gaits, prosthetic arms, neural ports, old scars across necks and faces. Veterans. Men and women who had already paid their share. Now working quiet jobs on the back end of a war that never stopped. One of the recruits muttered quietly beside Daniel. "Jesus, what happened to this place?" Daniel didn't answer. He had a feeling he knew. Too many wars, too many years. Eventually the group was led through the wide metal door into a long hall. And then the atmosphere changed completely. A man in a perfectly pressed uniform stood waiting for them. He looked like he had stepped out of an old military recruitment poster. Broad shoulders, perfect posture, chest covered in bright campaign ribbons. His boots shined like mirrors, and his face wore the biggest grin Daniel had ever seen. "Gentlemen!" His voice filled the hall. "Welcome!" The recruits blinked in surprise. The sergeant walked toward them energetically, clapping his hands once. "I'm Sergeant Jenkins, and I have the pleasure of being the first man to officially congratulate you." He looked each of them in the eye like they were honored guests. "Because every one of you has made a courageous decision." Some of the recruits shifted awkwardly. Jenkins didn't seem to notice. "Now, first things first." He gestured towards the doorway. "You gentlemen must be hungry." They were. The mess hall was surprisingly nice. Real food, not ration bars. Fresh bread, stew, rice, fruit. Some of the men looked suspicious as they filled their trays. One whispered to Daniel, "This feels like a last meal." Daniel half smiled. "Maybe it is." Sergeant Jenkins joined them at the long table, still smiling, still cheerful. While the men started eating, he opened a thick folder and began passing out thin digital tablets. "All right, gentlemen," he said casually. "Time for a bit of paperwork." Each tablet displayed a personal contract. The room grew quiet. Men stopped chewing. Eyes scanned numbers, terms, obligations, payouts. Reactions varied wildly. One man laughed out loud. "Holy shit." Another shook his head slowly. "Damn." The mechanic from the transport leaned back in his chair. "Well, guess I'm really doing this." One of the younger recruits looked pale, but he still tapped the sign icon. The tablet chimed softly. Contract accepted. Across the table, another man wiped tears from his eyes before signing. Every story here had led to this moment. Daniel picked up his own tablet last. He already knew what it would say, but seeing it still made his chest tighten. The terms were clear. Debt assumption, family financial protection, officer compensation structure, bonus tiers, command authority, and the title assignment, Auxiliary Brigade Officer Candidate. Projected rank upon acceptance, Captain. Daniel read the number again. It was real. Enough to wipe out everything. Enough to secure Elena and the kids forever. For a moment his hands trembled slightly. He thought about the kitchen, the backyard, the swing set. Then he pressed sign. The tablet chimed. Contract accepted. Around the table the last signatures finished. Sergeant Jenkins stood up, clapping his hands again. "Well done, gentlemen." He looked genuinely proud. "Allow me to congratulate you all. You have just joined the United States Auxiliary Brigade." The men exchanged uncertain looks. Some smiled, some just looked numb. Jenkins walked around the table shaking hands. "Welcome aboard. Good choice. Glad to have you." He stopped when he reached Daniel. The sergeant glanced down at the table in Daniel's hands. He saw the rank designation. His expression changed instantly. The smile remained, but his posture snapped straight. Without hesitation, he stepped back and raised a sharp salute. "Welcome to the Auxiliary Brigade, Captain." The entire table went silent. The other recruits stared at Daniel. Daniel blinked in surprise. He slowly stood. Old training surfaced automatically. He returned the salute. Sergeant Jenkins lowered his head, still grinning. "Glad to have you, sir." Daniel looked around the room at the men he had just met hours earlier. Many of them were staring at him with the same respect they had shown in the transport. Some nodded. The mechanic even gave him a quiet thumbs up. Daniel took a slow breath. 20 years ago, he had been a 19-year-old private. Now, somehow, he had just been handed command. He looked back at Sergeant Jenkins. "Thank you, Sergeant." Jenkins gestured towards the door. "Orientation begins in 10 minutes. He grinned. "Captain." After the meal, the recruits were guided through a series of corridors deeper into the base. The mood had changed. Food had put a little life back into the men, but the reality of where they were settled heavier now. Signs pointed them towards orientation. Before entering the main hall, they were given a short break. "Restrooms to the left," a board corporal said. 5 minutes. Men shuffled in and out quietly. Some washed their faces. Some just stared at themselves in the mirror like they were trying to recognize the person who had signed the contract. Daniel splashed cold water on his face. In the mirror, he saw a tired 43-year-old man, balding, lines around his eyes, scars he had forgotten about. But underneath the wear of the years, something else had surfaced. Focus. He dried his hands and stepped back into the hallway. The orientation hall was enormous, a theater designed for hundreds. Rows of steep seating climbed towards the back wall like stadium stands. Every seat was filling. Transport after transport had been unloading men all morning. Daniel saw the same thing everywhere. Different faces, different ages, different histories, but the same underlying pattern. Life had not been kind to most of them. Some were barely 20. Others were older than Daniel. There were factory workers, construction laborers, a few professionals mixed in, but many carried the look of men who had already been knocked around by the world. Divorces, debt, addictions, bankruptcy, bad luck, second chances, or last chances. Daniel sat with the men from his transport. The mechanic nodded at him. "You're our officer now, Captain," he said quietly. Daniel shook his head slightly. "Let's just get through orientation first." More recruits filled in. Soon the room had several hundred men. The noise built into a low, restless murmur. Then suddenly, "Attention!" The command cut through the theater like a rifle crack. Daniel's body reacted instantly. He stood up sharply, old muscle memory snapping into place before his mind even processed it. Several men near him copied the movement. Others looked confused for a second before scrambling to stand as well. Within moments, the entire theater was on its feet. The side doors opened. A colonel entered. He walked slowly down the center aisle. The room fell silent. Daniel had seen wounded officers before, but this man was something else. The colonel's body looked like a map of every war the United States had fought in the last 30 years. His right arm was mechanical. His left leg was reinforced prosthetic. Scars climbed across his jaw and disappeared under the collar of his fatigues. One eye was artificial. Thin metal plates showed through the skin along his temple. He looked like a man who had been broken apart and rebuilt several times, and somehow kept coming back. He reached the stage and turned towards the recruits. "At ease." Daniel relaxed first. The others followed a moment later. Then everyone sat. The colonel rested his mechanical hand on the podium. His voice when he spoke was calm, direct, completely sincere. "Gentlemen," he looked across the theater slowly, "you have volunteered for the United States Auxiliary Brigade." No theatrics, no fake enthusiasm, just the truth. "This unit exists for one purpose." He paused. "To fight." A few men shifted uneasily. The colonel continued. "You will be deployed as frontline infantry." Another pause. "The first in." A ripple moved through the crowd. The colonel suddenly smiled. It was not cruel, not mocking, just honest. Don't look so worried. A few men laughed nervously. That just means more glory. He leaned slightly against the podium. And more kills. This time the laughter was louder. Some tension broke. The colonel raised a hand. Let me reassure you of something. His eyes became firm. Every contract you signed has already been validated. Your debts are assumed. Your families are protected. Your loved ones will be taken care of. He scanned the room. No matter what happens to you, that part landed heavy. Some men looked down, some nodded slowly. The colonel continued. You are here because the United States needs men willing to fight, men willing to stand in the first line. He straightened. And you are joining the greatest military tradition in the history of mankind. His voice began to grow stronger, not shouting, not building. This nation built the most powerful empire the world has ever known. Not with money, not with technology, with soldiers. He tapped the podium with his metal finger. For 250 years, American warriors have crossed oceans, deserts, jungles, and cities to defend our interests, to defeat our enemies, to shape the world. The theater had gone very quiet. The colonel's voice filled the room. War is not an accident. War is not a failure. War is a way of life. He smiled again. And there is no life more honest. His artificial eye reflected the lights above them. In combat, you will discover something the rest of the world never understands. Clarity, purpose, brotherhood. He paused one last time. And glory. He spread his arms slightly. Gentlemen, welcome to the profession of arms. The theater exploded into mixed reactions. Some men stood and cheered. Others clapped nervously. Some sat frozen in their seats. A few looked outright terrified. Reality had just landed on them. Daniel sat quietly, and he was smiling. Not because he believed every word, but because he remembered the dust, the chaos, the smell of hot metal, the strange silence that followed a firefight. He remembered the first time he had killed a man up close, so close he could see the surprise in the man's eyes, so close that when the rounds hit, smoke curled briefly from the wound as the heat escaped. War was brutal, ugly, terrifying. But the colonel was right about one thing. There was a clarity to it, a brutal, honest simplicity. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. For the first time in 25 years, he felt like he understood the world again. And somewhere inside him, the old Marine woken up. After orientation, the men were marched across the base to their housing. The building was enormous. A concrete block warehouse converted into a squad bay big enough to hold several hundred recruits. The ceiling was high with exposed steel beams and long rows of hanging lights. Metal racks filled the room in perfectly straight lines. Each man received two things, a rack, a trunk. That was it. Home sweet home, someone muttered. No one laughed. The next 2 weeks moved fast, almost violently fast. It wasn't full boot camp, not even close, but it was compressed military education. The training staff called it basic orientation phase. The purpose was simple. Turn a few hundred civilians into something that at least looked like soldiers. They were issued uniforms, boots, field jackets, belts, utility gear. Everything had to be fitted, adjusted, marked with their identification numbers. Daniel stood in line with the others as they received their gear. Most of the men were assigned the same rank, private. It was written directly into their contracts. A handful of specialists were elevated to warrant officers, mechanics, engineers, drone technicians, medical staff. Daniel was one of the only few men issued officer insignia, captain. The small silver bars felt strange on his collar. He hadn't worn rank in 25 years. The instructors ran them through the fundamentals, rank structure, chain of command, how to salute, how to stand at attention, how to march in formation, daily schedules, inspection procedures, radio etiquette, basic field discipline. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Most of the recruits had never seen a military base before, and many of them were struggling just to exist without their usual crutches. The first week was ugly. Men went through withdrawal everywhere. Nicotine, alcohol, painkillers, stimulants, whatever they had been using to survive life before this. Some men threw up in the bathrooms. Some shook through the night. A few sweated and trembled so badly they had to be helped to their racks. The training staff barely reacted. They had seen it all before. One grizzled staff sergeant walked past a recruit dry heaving into a trash can and simply said, "Hydrate." That was the level of sympathy. Still, they didn't punish the men for it. Withdrawals were expected, planned for, part of the intake process. The one indulgence was allowed: nicotine. Cigarettes, vapes. The military issued a daily allotment. It instantly became the most valuable currency in the squad bay. Men gambled for them, traded them, bartered favors for them. Card games ran constantly during downtime. Daniel had been sober for years. No cigarettes, no alcohol, no drugs. He quietly handed his daily nicotine allowance to the men who needed it most. At first they tried to pay him back. He waved it off. Take it. Eventually they stopped asking. Word spread quickly. The old Marine captain who gave away his smokes. Something else happened during those 2 weeks. People started gravitating towards Daniel. It began with the men from his transport. They stuck close to him automatically, shared meals, sat near him in the training, asked him questions about military life. But the influence spread. Young recruits came to him at night after lights out. They talked about their lives, failed businesses, broken homes, parents who had kicked them out, mistakes they couldn't undo. Daniel mostly listened. Sometimes that was all they needed. The older men appreciated him too. They saw him as steady, experienced. Not arrogant, just solid. The squad bay was full of rough personalities, but Daniel moved through it calmly, never judging anyone, never acting superior. Just another man who had chosen the same road they had. Over time, something changed. Without trying to, Daniel became the center of the unit. The men with the neck tattoo never stayed far away from him. His name was Marcus Brick Kowalski, 6'4", built like a forklift, thick forearms covered in old scars and faded ink. He had grown up in rough neighborhoods and had the kind of quiet menace that made aggressive men rethink their decisions. Brick had worked construction most of his life, welding, demolition, heavy equipment. He knew how to build things and break them. The first night in the squad bay, he had claimed the rack next to Daniel's without asking. "Figured you might need backup, Captain." Daniel had laughed. "I'll survive." Brick shrugged. "Maybe." But the arrangement stuck. Where Daniel was calm, Brick was intimidating. Where Daniel listened, Brick watched. Many might have pushed boundaries, but an older officer quickly changed their minds when they saw Brick sitting nearby. The funny part was that Brick treated Daniel with absolute respect. Not formal military respect, something deeper, loyalty. One night during smoke break, Brick sat beside him in the barracks. "You know what the guys say about you?" Daniel sighed. "Afraid to ask." Brick grinned. "They call you Dad." Daniel rubbed his face. "Ugh, great." Brick laughed quietly. "Relax, it's a compliment." He nodded towards the squad bay windows where men were laughing and playing cards. "These guys never had someone like you around." Daniel looked back at the building. "Someone like what?" Brick shrugged. "Someone who gives a damn." He stood up and stretched. "Anyway," Brick cracked his neck, "you keep being the good cop." He patted his own massive chest. "I'll handle the rest." Daniel smiled. The arrangement worked perfectly, because even the roughest men in the squad bay knew something. If you disrespected Captain Mercer, you didn't just answer to him, you answered to Brick, and no one in the barracks was interested in that fight. By the end of 2 weeks, the transformation was visible. Haircut, uniforms fitted, posture corrected. Men who had arrived broken and scattered now moved in rough formations. Not soldiers yet, but something closer. The instructors had begun referring to them as a company. And when the recruits gathered in the evenings, they naturally clustered around one man, the quiet middle-aged captain, who had lived more life than most of them, who listened without judgment, and who reminded them, without ever saying it directly, that even men who had been beaten down by life could still stand up and fight.